at school we tend to talk a lot about science, and we talk a lot about physics and areas like that, and learning the basics. How does the world work? But when it comes to scientists working to actually improve things, it's often engineering. So most people who study a science degree end up in a field, if they're going to stay in sort of kind of in the general area, often end up in engineering, because that's actually where you put your science into practice. And a lot of, there's nothing wrong with doing pure science and doing pure science research. I do that. I think it's great. But for a lot of people, that ability to take an idea and then actually make things better in the world is what kind of is kind of really motivating for a job. So yeah, if you like science, it's worth keeping the eye open for engineering possibilities, because that's where you get to actually really make a difference with your science.
My guest this week is Professor Trevor Cox, who's been described as the David Attenborough of the acoustic realm. Professor Cox is an award-winning acoustic engineer, award-winning author, and is also a Guinness World Record holder. He has a PhD in acoustics from Salford University. He's a former president of the Institute of Acoustics, and he is currently a Professor of Acoustic Engineering at Salford University, as well as being the author of 2 popular science books, Now You're Talking and Sonic Wonderland, which is called the Sound Book in the American version, which you can see over my shoulder. Professor Cox, welcome to STEM with Mr. N.
Hi there.
It's a pleasure to have you on, and can we just start with, what is acoustic engineering?
Well, acoustics is the science of sound. It's not just about guitars. So I'm interested in how sound works, but being an engineer, I'm interested in manipulating things. So for example, I've got projects on hearing aids. So I try and understand how sound interacts with hearing aids and then make them work better.
And how is sound actually produced? What is the process, and what does it go through to reach our ears?
Well, it varies between the sources, but if we take speaking as we're doing that now, what happens is I breathe out of my lungs, and then here in what you might call the voice box, actually my larynx opens and closes and creates little buzzing sounds. And that's actually, when you talk, where the source of a lot of the sounds, particularly sort of E sounds, are. Then it gets altered by my mouth. You can see my mouth moves, making different words. Then you've got air vibrations. And so those air vibrations go for the air, in this case, through a microphone to your headphones. And then they go into your ear canal, eventually down your ear canal to your eardrum, vibrate ear parts, and eventually turning into electricity that goes up into the brain.
And obviously you've said that one of the things you do is research into sound, but what is a sort of typical day-to-day in the life of a Professor of Acoustic Engineering?
Well, it's hugely varied. One of the nice things about working in university, it's very varied. So it might be doing something like going into the lab and doing some measurements. So for example, I measured a scale model of Stonehenge. So I might be in there playing around with my little model scale Stonehenge, seeing how the acoustics of that is. It could be turning up and lecturing, teaching the students the latest, say, machine learning around audio and how that works. Or it could be going off and talking to politicians or the media, trying to make people aware of how acoustics could be better and how we could make the world sound better.
And I was reading about some of the research you're doing into things like hearing aids. What is the purpose of that? Because obviously hearing aids have been out for a long time and technology has improved. So where is your research focusing on that?
The issue around hearing aids is the take-up isn't very good. So about 40% of people who could benefit from hearing aids have them and use them often enough. And there's a sort of perception that they don't work very well. And there's also a fact that in certain conditions, they don't work well. And the classic case would be, let's say you're in a school dining room, it's really noisy, lots of people are chatting, and you're trying to pick out your friend talking. And that's a really difficult case to deal with. Now, in a hearing, that's called the cocktail party effect, because it was invented around the time people were having cocktail parties. But it's the same thing your brain's trying to do. And the thing is when you try and deal with that speech and noise problem, you have the hearing aid, receives a signal on the microphone, processes it, does something to make it better, but it's still got to go for the ear, which isn't functioning in 100% the way that it would be in say a young adult. And so your brain has just poorer signals to work off. It's not quite like vision. I've worn contact lenses all my life. I stick my contact lenses in, I'm back to perfect vision. It's not the same with hearing.
And I'm a contact wearer myself as well, so I know what it's like when I don't have my glasses. But as you say, that's very easily rectified. You put glasses on, you put contacts in. What sort of impact does the poor hearing quality have on people that require hearing aids?
Well, it's known to be a risk factor for dementia, for example. Exactly what's going on, I don't know, but it's one of the big risk factors for people developing dementia. I mean, I'm finding it now. I've got to the age where communication in things like pubs is harder. So it's like the cocktail party effect. It's picking out that speech and noise is harder because my ears are not as good as they used to be. And actually, as you get older, your brain is less good at processing. It's a really complicated thing it's trying to do. And what does that mean? It means maybe I don't go to the pub, so I get a bit more lonely, so I lose my social life a bit, don't interact with my friends so much. And those are sort of risk factors for dementia.
And one of the other areas of research that I'd read about that you're interested in is architectural acoustics. What's involved in that?
But if we take any space we're in, the acoustics of that space, how the sound reflects off the walls, the floor, and the ceiling affect what you hear. I mean, it's most obvious. You say were to go from your bedroom singing and go into your bathroom and start singing, your voice sounds very different, and that's all the effect of the sound bouncing around and reflecting around the bathroom, compared to being absorbed in your bedroom, which is full of lots of soft stuff like your bed. And so in room acoustics, we're trying to use those reflections, which amplify sound, creates a bit of a bloom to it, what we call reverberation, to make things sound nicer. So that could be making orchestra sound more pleasant. Orchestras playing outside sound really dull. Put them in a big grand concert hall, they sound much better. Or it could be working in, say, a classroom where you're trying to make it easy for the teacher to talk to the pupil. Talking without any reflections is hard work. And so when you design a classroom well, you use the walls to help reflect sound to make the teacher's voice carry easier to the pupils so you can have a conversation easier.
And there's obviously, with that research, with the engineering side of it, with the hearing aids and then with the architectural acoustics, do you have to cross paths with a lot of other STEM fields to get all of this to work together?
Yeah, I mean, one of the great things about working in acoustics is it's almost automatically crosses over areas. So if you look at my research, some of it looks like physics. So I did a physics degree, but then you look at stuff and it looks like psychology because you're trying to understand how people respond to sound. So I would myself do psychology, but I'll also work with psychologists, neuroscientists, all sorts of kind of different people to try and understand not only how sound physically behaves, but also how people respond to it. And that to me is what really drew me into acoustics. I was good at science, but I was just fascinated by how people respond to sound.
And on that point, that's a good time to go back into your past about what first actually got you interested in STEM subjects.
Well, I think I was very influenced by my parents. So my dad was a physical chemist. He worked at Bristol University, and my mum was a botanist. And it's funny because I remember them interacting with my children and how they go about sort of interacting with children, explaining how the world works. And so I suspect I was indoctrinated at quite a young age into thinking in a scientific way. It wasn't sufficient for me to go wandering around Bristol Zoo or wherever we were enjoying ourselves. We had to read the notices and find out what animal it was and why. And so I think there's a certain amount of indoctrination and sort of attitude to life that came about. And I had an aptitude. Now, whether that's just because of young training or because influence of parents, I don't know. But I think that also helps you have an aptitude for it. It kind of encourages you to keep going.
And having that sort of coming from your parents and inspiring you, is that why, as you've gone into your career, you decided to do the science communication with writing the popular science books?
I guess so. Neither of them were particularly into science communication. So it's something I've done differently. I think acoustics is a wonderful subject, but it's not well known. So people I'm talking to here have probably heard of physics and heard of, I don't know, electrical engineering, but acoustics? Did you know that was a topic you could study, you could have a career in? So there's quite a lot of areas of STEM that are kind of hidden, and acoustics is one of them. So since the mid-90s, so years, I've been out about talking about why it's a wonderful thing to work in. And when you start doing it, you just try different things. So I've done podcasts, I've done radio, presenting BBC Radio, I've done books. Just lots of different ways of talking to people about this fascinating subject.
I had the privilege of hearing you speak at Glasgow Science Centre, and I learned a lot about acoustics, and it's really strange that it's not something we know a lot about, given the fact we use acoustics obviously every single day of our lives. But as technology's advanced, I remember something you spoke about that night was about AI and people being able to have communication with, dead relatives. As AI has progressed in the years since then, is this something that's becoming a danger? Do you think that people will be able to put out speeches by famous people that they haven't actually delivered?
Yeah, it's funny. When I wrote that book, Now You're Talking, which wasn't that long ago, I speculated on this. It was not quite happening, but only a couple of days ago on the news, they were talking about people faking people's speech to basically and phishing scams. So they get voices which sound a bit like relatives of yours, and they ring you up and sort of kind of trying to get you to give bank details and things like that. So it is actually now happening that people are trying to use these very, we can now have really good synthesized speech which sounds like the individual, and they're now using that for, unfortunately, nefarious uses. They're doing nasty things with it, but they do have positive effects for these sort of kind of synth systems. And I think the most obvious one is where people lose voices because of disease like motor neuron disease, and then the ability to have a personalized voice which actually sounds like you rather than have to have a robotic, Stephen Hawking voice is quite an advance. So with all these technologies, there's always the sort of good and the bad side to them, I think.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about, STEM careers that are going to exist in the future that don't exist now that keep coming up, and this AI is one of them. With the AI voices, is there a way for acoustics professionals to be able to determine whether it is an AI voice that's being used in a recording or not?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a battle going on. So what happens is the people making these fake voices create a system, and then people work out ways to detect that system is there, looking for little tells, little traces in the speech signal that it's not really a human speaking. And then, of course, the people synthesizing voices go another step to get rid of that tell. So it's a kind of like it's a competition. They're continually fighting each other to find the best techniques to try and tell whether it's a fake voice or not. But it's getting to the point that it's pretty hard to tell sometimes whether it's a fake voice for short information giving. You can still tell if it's trying to do something like tell you a story, because still synthesized voices are still quite bland. They're not really as expressive as a real human. So we can still tell if they're false ourselves, but it's easy to get caught out with simple things like your bank account is being broken into. Can you give me your bank details, which is a bit more factual.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting to see how that progresses and, what other STEM careers come out of that sort of arms race between the AI.
Yeah, I mean, one of the really interesting developments for someone who's worked in acoustics all my career is how sound has become such an important way of interacting with artificial intelligence. If we think about, I was brought up on computers where you typed. More and more, we communicate through voice, whether that's talking to Alexa or whichever system you're using. And with robots, a lot of that communication now is done through speech. So actually, speech and acoustics has become more important as artificial intelligence has developed rather than less.
Which is interesting because everyone's talking about, how technology takes over and takes away from communication. So it's interesting that the acoustics area is actually becoming more important rather than less. And something else that I remember you talking about on that night, and it's something that I've told people about, was about music being done with performers that aren't actually real. I think it was a Japanese pop act where it was a fake performer. Was that another thing that you spoke about that has progressed more in that direction? Has there been more sort of robotic and fake music come out, or do you think AI is something as well that could be involved in that?
So I think generating music has come on leaps and bounds. So if you wanted to, if let's just say you make a TikTok and you wanted some backing music, it's fairly easy to find an AI where you could type some text in, like, give me some backing music which sounds upbeat and uplifting, or give me a backing track which is good to someone having a kind of accident or something, and you want one of those sort of kind of funny tracks. And you could get one which would generate something which is perfectly passable to go behind a video. It's not going to be the best bit of film music ever, but it's going to be pretty good. So that is advanced. And yeah, singing synthesis. There's been less emphasis on that, but it's still advancing. As speech synthesis has improved, so singing synthesis has as well. But it tracks a bit less effort. because there's just fewer applications for the sort of big companies to exploit. But the person you were thinking about was Hatsune Miku. It's worth looking up on YouTube. It is quite amazing. It's a phenomena using Vocaloid, where people go along to concerts to hear, her sing tracks which actually the audience have composed. I mean, that's really weird music. It's not the sort of thing I'd listen to, but it's hugely popular.
No, I agree. After that night, I did go home and I looked it up and was amazed at the number of people that were at a concert to watch, a hologram perform these songs that, as you say, the audience had written. And Pavarotti, it's the other one that I've shown people from that night, with Pavarotti's face on a screen, singing. I think it was Nessun Dorma.
Yeah, I mean that's really old, very slow to do synthesis. I bet you they could do it a lot better now. Yeah, that was a real labour of love from the guy who made that. But yeah, nowadays that would be relatively easy to make, and you get into a really interesting situation about who owns the voice at that point. Is the voice owned by Pavarotti, or if you've made a machine learning version of it, maybe it's owned by the machine now? And we're getting the same thing with Chat GPT. I think only today we've got authors suing the people behind that on the grounds of it's taken in their text and is using their text to make more stuff. So maybe there's lots of jobs for lawyers coming up as well.
Yes, well, my background was in music. I've got a degree in commercial music, so it was that business and law, and none of this was spoken about or discussed at that time. And that wasn't that long ago I graduated. Probably longer ago than my memory tells me it was, though. But it's amazing how much that has changed. So that's even something else as well, with people interested in the music industry, that could be, a shift going forward, as looking into the legalities of these sorts of things.
Yeah, but I think to reassure, I think with these AI music, it still comes down to the fact you have a computer making music and a computer sort of performing it. The human is missing. So it's good enough for, say, backing videos. But when it comes down to wanting to watch a gig, for most of us, we want to know there's some human behind it, whether that's some human suffering or human joy, and that involves a human. So there's always going to be the need for, I think, humans to actually make and perform music, which is really important to me. I mean, a lot of people in acoustics are musicians as well. I would hate the technology to put loads of musicians out of jobs, for example.
So that's a good positive note, that both of us reckon that there's still going to be plenty of room for acoustics and acoustic engineers to keep designing good sound spaces for hearing live music. Something else I want to ask you about that I'd mentioned in the introduction is you have a Guinness World Record. Could you tell us a bit about this Guinness World Record?
Yeah, so I've been lucky enough to actually have two. They're actually kind of behind my shoulder, aren't they? The oldest one was actually for the world's largest whoopee cushion, which was a stage prop from a stage show. But I've lost that one now. But the more recent one was for the world's longest echo. Actually, I mean, it's funnily enough, I had arguments with Guinness about it because it's not really an echo. An echo, I think, is going echo, and you hear echo back. And it's not. Actually, it's what's called reverberation. So it's that big booming sound you get at cathedrals. And this was actually in an oil depot up in Scotland, up near Inverness. And it was an oil depot which was made for shipping oil during World War II. So it was made bomb-proof. So what they did is they tunneled out a bit of the Scottish hill, and then they laid concrete into it. So it's this vast bomb-proof shelter, which used to be full of shipping oil, which is now empty. And if you go into that space, and I've been lucky enough to play a saxophone in it, and you play a note on the saxophone, at the low end, it will take a minute. You play a note, you stop, and it will carry on for a minute before it dies away to nothing. So it's incredibly reverberant, and so a really weird place to play music in.
And when you were saying you were arguing with Guinness about it, was that you were trying to get them to say the record was for the longest reverberation rather than the longest echo?
Yeah, so the Hamilton Mausoleum up in Glasgow used to hold the record, which we broke by, a minute. So we shattered the record, which is actually now 75 seconds. And they said, okay, yeah, you've broken the record. Here's your certificate. And then I said to them, well, actually, you've not got the right technical term here. Do you realize the actual technical term you want is reverberation? But they said, you've broken this record. Here's your certificate. So I have to keep explaining it's not for the right thing.
Just take it and accept it.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, it's interesting because it's the difference between technical language and sort of everyday language. So saying this amazing chamber went to, it's echoey, it's fine because it is, but the scientific term is reverberation, and that's something we get into all the time with acoustics. There's loads of terminology that musicians use which isn't technically matching up with what you describe in the science, so we have to be quite careful what we say and when, and explain it well.
So is there a difference between an echo and reverberation, or is just reverberation just the technical term for an echo?
So in acoustics, there's two kinds of echo, but the echo in architectural acoustics means you distinctly hear the same thing twice. So you go along, we used to go to the Free Trade Hall in Manchester, and you would hear the trumpet playing twice, once from the front and once from the back, you know, the reflection off the back wall. So an echo is echo, echo, whereas reverberation is just echo. It's adding to the original sound, but you don't hear a second sound. You just hear the first sound elongated, and that's the difference.
And with the architectural things, because you've mentioned a few different places that you've been and done things, have you been involved in yourself actually designing spaces that are used for sound, either, you know, whether that's like a recording studio where it's a bit of sound dampening to get a crisp sound, or, you know, concert venues? Have you been involved in that side of things?
Yeah, when I did my PhD, which was some time ago, after that, I got involved in designing treatments that go into rooms. So I wasn't designing the whole room. I was designing the things they put into the rooms to cure acoustic issues. And what I made were called diffusers. So if you have a flat wall in a room, what it does to sound is what is similar to what you get with light. You get a very clear image. And my diffusers do the equivalent of frosting the mirror to make the sound reflection blurred, and so it's knobbly stuff, it's rough stuff is what you're making. So I used to make acoustic diffusers, and they got used around the world. I mean, they got used as, you know, grand concert halls, as overhead canopies, in studios, as you mentioned. There's a big use of them there to try and take away the room, so that when you're making recordings, you just get the musicians. But also things like, you know, big churches. I worked for an American firm, so there were lots of grand churches they were building in America we used to do stuff for. So all sorts of different places.
And is that something you're still involved in now, or did you moved on from that into other areas of research?
I've just moved on to other areas, but I think one of the difference between being a scientist and an engineer is I think it's really important that you think as an engineer about actually making a difference and getting involved in that stage of, I've got this new science, let's make it into something that changes the world. And so I'm really proud of all these rooms that I worked on, that then kind of people who are sitting in the church better able to hear what's being said because of those diffusers that I designed. And it's really quite amazing to think of those sort of influences that you can have if you get into a field like engineering.
Yeah. And I also saw on the Salford University website, when I was just checking up some information, that another area of research you've been involved in is psychoacoustics. What is psychoacoustics?
Well, it's a bringing together of psychology and acoustics. So psychoacoustics is about how people respond to sound, and it's actually the bedrock of mostly what I do. So if I take something like, I'm designing a better washing machine, you know, and a better washing machine in my terms is one where the spin cycle doesn't make it sound like the thing is falling apart and is not too noisy. Who's making the judgment about whether it's too noisy or it sounds like it's badly made is a human. So we spend a lot of time here at Salford putting people in virtual reality systems or in listening rooms, playing sounds at them and going, what do you think that sounds? Does this one sound better? I mean, we just got a project, for example, looking at alert sounds on e-scooters. So e-scooters creep up behind pedestrians. They kind of, pedestrians are, I didn't hear that. So we have an alert sound on them. But what's the best one? What alerts the pedestrian without scaring them? And so you have lots of different alert sounds. You play it to people. You see how people respond. You have virtual reality simulations where people are walking along a virtual street, and then a scooter turns up. And so psychoacoustics is really, it's experimental psychology, but it's applied to understanding people's response to sound.
And I think you said something really important at the start of that answer, which is, you know, understanding that you can study these things, but engineering it to try and make life better for people. I think is something that gets missed sometimes when people talk about scientists or think about researchers, is that other element of trying to make things better for humanity and for people around about you.
Yeah, I think one thing that I remember from going through school and also seeing my children go through school is at school we tend to talk a lot about science. and we talk a lot about physics and areas like that, and learning the basics. How does the world work? But when it comes to scientists working to actually improve things, it's often engineering. So most people who study a science degree end up in a field, if they're going to stay in sort of kind of in the general area, often end up in engineering, because that's actually where you put your science into practice. And a lot of, there's nothing wrong with doing pure science and doing pure science research. I do that. I think it's great. But for a lot of people, that ability to take an idea and then actually make things better in the world is what kind of is kind of really motivating for a job. So yeah, if you like science, it's worth keeping the eye open for engineering possibilities, because that's where you get to actually really make a difference with your science.
And on that note, have you got any advice for any children or young people that have been listening to this or have been maybe thinking about acoustics that want to pursue that forward? What's the best way to pursue a career in acoustics, whether it's research or the engineering aspects of it?
I think one thing you've got to decide if you're working in sound is whether you're going down an artistic side or down a science side. Unfortunately, the way the education system works, at some point you usually have to make a decision. If you're really interested in doing things like I want to design concert halls or studios, or I want to design hearing aids, you need to keep the science up. Because if I say, I work with loudspeaker companies, if I want to design a loudspeaker, I need the maths, understand the maths and the physics of what's going on there to do the design. So you kind of need to have that basic STEM side if you want to get into the design side. Now, that's different to if you want to go and become a sound engineer who's sitting behind a desk and mixing bands, and that's a different kind of job. So one thing I'd say is understand the differences between the two of those. And there are people who do both, but in general, if you drop the science, you can't really do the sort of kind of engineering side. And by engineering, I mean making systems or audio or whatever it may be sound better, as opposed to sort of engineering as in the sound engineering sense, which is kind of like changing knobs on a mixing desk, putting microphones in to measure, to sort of kind of pick up guitar sounds, that kind of difference.
Yep. And I think that's an excellent point to end on, is that piece of great advice for how to pursue that route sort of into acoustics. So Trevor, thank you very much for giving up some time and joining me today. Where can people find your podcasts or find you on social media to follow all the interesting things that you are doing?
Well, fortunately, Trevor Cox is quite an unusual name. Unless you end up on the Canadian ice hockey person, you'll probably find me quite easy if you just look for Trevor Cox. And I'm on all the usual socials. You'll find me on YouTube. You'll find me on Twitter. And so you can find me quite easily on Salford University's website as well. You could go on the BBC Sounds and look for documentaries I've made, for example.
And I'm going to stop.